The Galactic Research Station Prometheus. Because apparently even in the far future, humans couldn't resist naming things after mythological figures who got spectacularly punished for their hubris, floated serenely in the void between three-star systems. It was, according to the brochures that nobody read, a shining beacon of interspecies cooperation and scientific advancement. In reality, it was more like a cosmic office building, where everyone pretended to get along while secretly judging each other's breathing patterns. The station housed representatives from 47 different species, each convinced they were the intellectual cream of the galactic crop. There were the Vorthak, who communicated through color-changing head crests and considered vocal speech primitive. The hegemony delegates, whose forearms allowed them to multitask with an efficiency that made human productivity look like a leisurely stroll through a park. And then there were the crystalline collective members, who existed partially in 11 dimensions, and had the insufferable habit of starting sentences with "from your limited three-dimensional perspective." In the far corner of Research Lab 7, tucked between a quantum spectrometer that hummed ominously and a coffee machine that had achieved sentience 3 weeks ago, but wasn't telling anyone, sat the most overlooked member of the entire station. She had claimed that particular corner on her first day, armed with nothing but a worn paperback novel and the kind of determined invisibility that only comes from years of practice. The other researchers had barely noticed her arrival 6 months ago. Velterin, the station's hegemony-appointed xenobiology specialist, had glanced at her ID badge, noted the word human in the species field, and promptly filed her under background noise. The Vorthak team leader had examined her with all 4 of his independently rotating eyes, decided she didn't pose a threat to his research grant applications, and had subsequently treated her like a piece of furniture that occasionally consumed coffee. This suited her perfectly. While the other researchers engaged in what they generously called collaborative discourse, which mostly involved taking turns explaining why everyone else's theories were laughably inadequate, she would sit in her corner, apparently absorbed in whatever ancient Earth literature she'd brought along. Today it was something called The Importance of Being Earnest, which she found deliciously ironic, given her current circumstances. Velterin, meanwhile, was holding court near the main workstation, his forearms gesticulating wildly as he explained his latest breakthrough in biocompatibility matrices. "The calculations are beyond dispute," he announced, his voice carrying that particular tone reserved for beings who had never been wrong about anything. "The protein synthesis rates clearly indicate that you've been calibrating your instruments incorrectly for 3 weeks, she murmured from her corner, not looking up from her book. Nobody heard her. They never. The crystalline representative, whose name was an untranslatable sequence of quantum fluctuations that everyone just called sparkles behind his back, materialized partially into their dimension. "From your limited three-dimensional perspective," he began, because of course he did. "These biocompatibility concerns seem significant. However, from the 11th dimension, the solution is quite obvious." "Oh, please do enlighten us," Velterin said with the kind of forced politeness that could strip paint. Sparkles began what could generously be called an explanation and more accurately described as an interdimensional ego massage. The other researchers gathered around, nodding sagely while secretly checking their chronometers to see how long they'd have to pretend to understand 11-dimensional protein folding. In her corner, the human researcher turned a page and tried not to smile. The coffee machine, which had been eavesdropping with the dedication of a truly committed artificial intelligence, gurgled what might have been mechanical laughter. The station operated on a perfectly predictable rhythm. Morning briefings where everyone shared their significant progress from the previous day. Afternoon collaboration sessions that were really just elaborate competitions to see who could use the most syllables to say the evening reports that somehow managed to transform the most mundane observations into galaxy-shaking discovery. Through it all, she sat in her corner, reading her books, occasionally glancing up to observe the academic theater with the detached amusement of someone watching a particularly elaborate nature documentary. The other researchers had long since categorized her as harmless human. Department of Vague Research Support. Her actual job description was so thoroughly buried in bureaucratic language that even she wasn't entirely sure what she was supposed to be doing, which was exactly how she preferred. Dr. Velterin had moved on to explaining quantum flux variations to a group of junior researchers who looked like they were contemplating the sweet release of spacing themselves. The Vorthak delegation was clustered around a holographic display, their head crests shifting through what she recognized as the color sequence for polite disagreement with underlying homicidal intention. Sparkles had thankfully dematerialized back to whichever dimension he called home, leaving only a faint shimmer and the lingering scent of ozone. Just another perfectly ordinary day on Prometheus Station, where the brightest minds in the galaxy gathered to prove that intelligence and wisdom were not, in fact, the same thing. The emergency alarm chose that moment to shatter the afternoon's carefully maintained pretense of productivity with a sound that could only be described as the dying scream of a mechanical banshee, having an existential crisis. Everyone stopped what they were doing. 4 dozen heads, crests, sensor arrays and probability matrices turned toward the central alert display, which was flashing a truly impressive shade of red, while cycling through warning messages in 47 different languages and 3 theoretical communication methods. The emergency klaxons had barely finished their melodic interpretation of impending doom when the station's artificial intelligence, AIDEN, which stood for Adaptive Intelligence Designed for Everything Necessary, but really meant Anxious Intelligence Destined for Existential Nightmare, began its announcement. Critical system of failure detected. Containment breach in quantum reactor core 7. Estimated time until catastrophic cascade failure, 23 minutes and 47 seconds. Also, the coffee machine in Lab 7 would like everyone to know it's not responsible for this. The response was immediate and spectacular in its complete lack of coordination. Velteren's forearms began moving in what could charitably be called a coordinated response but looked more like an octopus having a seizure. Everyone remain calm, he shouted, which had roughly the same effect as suggesting that fire remain. This is clearly a minor calibration error in the sensor array. The Vorthok team leader's head crest cycled rapidly through colors that roughly translated to, oh no, we're all going to die in the void like cosmic dust motes. His attempt at leadership involved a lot of rapid head bobbing and what sounded like prayers to several different gods, none of whom were apparently taking calls. Sparkles chose this moment to rematerialize, his crystalline form flickering between dimensions like a cosmic strobe light having technical difficulties. From the 11th dimension, he announced with impressive timing. This catastrophe appears quite manageable. One simply needs to recalibrate the quantum flux inhibitors, while simultaneously reversing the polarity of the tachyon field generators. Brilliant, Dr. Velteren exclaimed, grasping at interdimensional straws. How exactly does one reverse the polarity of tachyon field generators? Sparkles paused, which in his case involved existing in several states of uncertainty simultaneously. Well, from your limited 3-dimensional perspective, it would be challenging. Translation, he had absolutely no idea. The junior researchers, meanwhile, had divided into 3 distinct groups. Group 1 was frantically consulting their data pads while making the sort of distressed noises typically associated with small mammals trapped in mazes. Group 2 was engaged in what they called emergency protocols, which mostly involved running in circles while carrying important-looking equipment to nowhere in particular. Group 3 had decided that this was an excellent time to update their personal files and send messages to loved ones. 20 minutes and 15 seconds remaining, AIDEN announced with the cheerful persistence of a doomsday clock with excellent customer service training. Reactor core temperature rising to levels that could charitably be described as somewhat concerning. The coffee machine suggests everyone might want to try decaf. Dr. Velteren had reached the technical consultation phase of panic, which involved pulling up holographic displays covered in incomprehensible diagrams, while making authoritative statements about quantum mechanics. The problem is clearly in the primary containment matrix, he declared, pointing at a schematic that looked like someone had sneezed on a geometry textbook. We need to recalibrate the neutrino flux dampeners, while simultaneously engaging the emergency harmonic stabilizer. What are harmonic stabilizers? One of the junior researchers asked. Dr. Velteren paused. They stabilize harmonics. What harmonics? The important one. In her corner, the human researcher watched this display of galactic expertise with the sort of fascination usually reserved for watching elaborate domino displays collapse in slow motion. She had closed her book, not because the situation was particularly urgent, but because the entertainment value of live academic meltdown was too good to miss. The Vorthik delegation had abandoned all pretense of leadership and was now engaged in what appeared to be ritualistic panic dancing. Their head crests had settled into a pattern that roughly translated to, "We accept our doom with colorful resignation." One of them was making high-pitched whirring sounds that might have been prayers, or possibly just the alien equivalent of screaming into the void. 17 minutes remaining. Iden continued with relentless optimism. Reactor containment field strength, now at 67% and falling. This is approximately equivalent to trying to hold back a tsunami with a strongly worded letter. Sparkles had fully materialized now, which was never a good sign. When beings who existed in 11 dimensions felt the need to anchor themselves completely in 3-dimensional space, it usually meant things had progressed beyond manageable crisis and into interdimensional oh dear territory. Perhaps, he suggested with the desperate creativity of someone whose usual solution of view it from the 11th dimension had stopped working, we could evacuate to the emergency pods. Dr. Velterin's forearms stopped their frantic gesticulation. The emergency pods were removed last month for routine maintenance. When will they be reinstalled? Next month. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire room full of allegedly brilliant beings simultaneously realizes that their advanced degrees and cosmic superiority complexes are about as useful as chocolate teapots in a supernova. 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Iden announced, apparently deciding that precision in doom counting was important for morale. Containment field now at 42%. This is the answer to life, the universe, and everything. But probably not in the way anyone was hoping. The human researcher glanced at her watch, an actual mechanical timepiece that the other researchers had mocked as quaintly primitive, and made a small note in the margin of her book. She had been timing their crisis response, and so far the galaxy's finest minds had managed to accomplish precisely nothing, except demonstrate that panic was indeed a universal constant. "Excuse me." The voice was quiet, polite, and came from the corner that everyone had been studiously ignoring for the past 6 months. It cut through the cacophony of alien panic like a butter knife through cosmic hysteria. Everyone turned to stare at the human researcher, who had stood up and was walking toward the main console with the unhurried pace of someone heading to make a cup of tea rather than prevent galactic catastrophe. "I couldn't help but notice," she continued in the same conversational tone one might use to comment on the weather, "that you're all approaching this completely wrong." Dr. Velteran's forearms froze mid-gesture. "I beg your pardon." "The quantum reactor," she said, settling herself at a secondary console that nobody had been using because it was just for basic diagnostics. Her fingers began moving across the interface with the kind of casual familiarity that suggested she'd done this before. "It's not actually failing." The silence that followed was so complete that even Iden seemed to hold its electronic breath. 12 minutes and 15 seconds remaining, the AI finally announced, apparently deciding that someone should maintain professional standards. Containment field at 37%. Also, the coffee machine is brewing a fresh pot, because it believes everyone will need caffeine for the inevitable paperwork. "What do you mean it's not failing?" Sparkles demanded, his crystalline form flickering with what might have been indignation or interdimensional confusion. The human researcher pulled up a holographic display that looked nothing like the incomprehensible diagrams everyone else had been consulting. This one was clean, simple, and actually made sense, which was probably why none of the advanced alien minds had thought to look at it. "The reactor isn't failing," she repeated patiently. "It's doing exactly what it's supposed to do when someone incorrectly initializes the quantum containment protocols during a routine maintenance cycle." She gestured at the display. "The cascade failure warning isn't a malfunction, it's a safety feature. The reactor is threatening to shut down completely unless you reset the initialization sequence." Dr. Velteran stared at the display. "But the temperature readings are measuring the cooling system, not the reactor core." Someone reversed the sensor inputs. She highlighted a section of code that was quite literally backwards. "Probably happened during the last software update. The reactor is actually running about 15 degrees cooler than normal, which is why the cooling system is working overtime and heating up." The Vorthik team leader's head crest had settled into a color pattern that roughly translated to confused but hopeful. "But the containment field readings are displaying as a percentage of maximum possible field strength, rather than minimum required field strength. 37% of maximum is still about 400% of what you actually need. She pulled up another display showing the actual containment parameters. You could run a small star in there if you wanted to. 11 minutes and 42 seconds, Aiden announced, though it sounded slightly less confident than before. Containment field at wait, let me recalculate. Running diagnostics. Oh. Everyone waited. Never mind, Aiden continued with the electronic equivalent of embarrassment. Everything is fine. The coffee machine would like to apologize for the misunderstanding and offers complimentary beverages to anyone who promises not to mention this in their performance review. The human researcher was already deep in the system, her fingers dancing across multiple interfaces with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from actually understanding what you're doing, rather than just knowing what you're supposed to say about it. Lines of code scrolled past, diagnostic routines engaged and disengaged, and slowly but surely the warning lights began shifting from certain doom red to mildly concerning yellow to everything's fine green. How did you? Dr. Velteran began, then stopped. What exactly is your background? She glanced up from her work with a small smile. I used to design quantum containment systems, before I decided to take a quieter job in research support. Her fingers continued their work. Turns out when you spend 15 years building these things, you get pretty good at fixing them when someone else breaks them. But your file said, Sparkles began, that I'm human, with a background in general research. Yes, that's what I put on the application. She completed another diagnostic sequence. I may have simplified my CV a bit. Amazing how much more peaceful life becomes when people think you're not qualified to have opinions about their work. The Vorthek delegation was now cycling through colors that could best be translated as dawning comprehension mixed with existential embarrassment. Their leader managed a sound that might have been a question. Oh, you want to know what I actually did before? She leaned back from the console, having apparently finished whatever she'd been doing. I was the lead engineer on the Terran Deep Space Initiative's quantum reactor development program. We built the power systems for about 60% of the stations currently operating in this sector. She gestured casually at the now cheerfully green status displays, including this one. Systems nominal, Aiden announced with obvious relief. All readings within normal parameters. Reactor core temperature optimal. Containment field at maximum efficiency. The coffee machine reports that the fresh pot is ready and suggests everyone pretend the last 20 minutes never happened. The assembled researchers stared at the human in their corner, except she wasn't in her corner anymore. She was standing at the main diagnostic console like she owned the place, which in a technical sense, she sort of did. Why didn't you say anything? Dr. Velteran asked, his voice carrying the tone of someone whose entire worldview was undergoing rapid reconstruction. She shrugged and picked up her book from where she'd left it. You never asked. Besides, I was enjoying the book. She held up the importance of being earnest with a smile that suggested she found the irony delicious. Oscar Wilde had some interesting thoughts about the value of being underestimated. As she walked back toward her corner, the other researchers parted like she was carrying something contagious, which, from their perspective, she was competence had a way of spreading, and none of them were entirely sure they were ready for that kind of infection. Part 4, New Respect, Same Corner. The aftermath of a narrowly averted galactic catastrophe, it turned out, was remarkably similar to the aftermath of a particularly awkward dinner party. Everyone stood around making polite conversation while desperately trying to pretend that the previous hour hadn't fundamentally altered the social dynamics of their little floating research community. Velteran, whose forearms had finally stopped their interpretive dance of panic, cleared his throat in the way beings do when they're about to say something they'd rather not. Perhaps, he began carefully, we should discuss revising our emergency protocol. Excellent idea, the human researcher agreed without looking up from her book, having settled back into her corner as if she hadn't just casually saved everyone from becoming cosmic debris. Might I suggest starting with read the manual before assuming catastrophic failure? The suggestion hung in the air like a particularly pungent observation about someone's personal hygiene. Several junior researchers suddenly discovered that their datapads required immediate and intense scrutiny. Sparkles, who had been flickering between dimensions with the nervous energy of someone whose interdimensional superiority complex had just been thoroughly deflated, finally stabilized enough to speak. From the perspective of someone who clearly didn't understand the full scope of the situation, he said with what might have been humility if beings made of living crystal were capable of such things. "Your expertise, why thank you," she replied with the sort of gracious politeness usually reserved for compliments on casserole recipes. "I do so enjoy being appreciated for my ability to read basic system diagnostic." The Vorthak team leader's head crest had settled into a pattern that experienced xenolinguists would recognize as profound embarrassment with undertones of grateful relief. He managed a series of clicks and whistles that his translator rendered as, "We acknowledge oversight regarding your qualifications." "What qualifications would those be?" she asked innocently. "According to my official file, I'm just here for general research support." This was, everyone now realized, the kind of statement that could mean absolutely anything. Research support could involve filing reports, or it could involve designing the fundamental infrastructure that kept everyone alive. The fact that nobody had bothered to ask which kind said more about their assumptions than they cared to examine. Viltaran made another attempt at professional recovery. "Perhaps we could arrange for you to consult on our ongoing quantum mechanics research. Your insights would be unnecessary," she finished pleasantly. "I've been listening to your discussions for 6 months. Your work is perfectly adequate for academic publication, it's just not particularly practical." The word adequate landed in the conversation like a small but precisely placed explosive device. In academic circles, adequate was roughly equivalent to suggesting someone's research was suitable for use as decorative paperweights. "What do you mean not practical?" Dr. Viltaran asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to know. She marked her place in her book again, a gesture that was beginning to make everyone nervous, and gestured toward their main research display. "Well, take your biocompatibility matrices for instance. Mathematically elegant, theoretically sound, completely useless." "Useless?" Sparkles sputtered, momentarily existing in several states of indignation simultaneously. "The protein synthesis calculations assume ideal laboratory conditions that don't exist anywhere in actual space," she explained patiently. "Your baseline measurements are taken from organisms in perfect health. But space travel stresses biological systems in ways that throw off all your pretty numbers. It's like designing a car based on how well it works when it's not moving." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when a group of people simultaneously realize they've spent months working on something that was doomed from the start. "However," she continued, apparently taking pity on their collective existential crisis, "if you adjusted your baseline parameters to account for the quantum field fluctuations inherent in faster-than-light travel, and recalibrated your protein synthesis models based on stressed rather than optimal biological states, your research might actually help someone." She said this with the casual air of someone suggesting a minor correction to a grocery list, rather than fundamentally restructuring months of complex theoretical work. "That would require starting over completely," one of the junior researchers pointed out. "Yes," she agreed cheerfully, "but this time you'd be solving a real problem instead of an interesting one." Dr. Viltaran's forearms had begun moving again, but now it was less panicked octopus and more being carefully thinking through complex implications. "Your suggestions, they have merit. Perhaps we could discuss them further. I'm always here," she replied, settling back with her book. "Same corner, same time, every day. Though I should mention that tomorrow I'll be reading Pride and Prejudice, which seems appropriately thematic." As the researchers began to disperse, their conversations had taken on a distinctly different tone. Where before they had spoken with the confident authority of beings who knew they were the smartest entities in any given room, now there was a certain cautious quality to their pronouncement. The kind of caution that comes from realizing that the quiet person in the corner might actually be listening, and might actually know what they're talking about. The Vorthak delegation clustered together, their head crests cycling through patterns that roughly translated to, "How many other humans are there on this station? And what else don't we know about them?" The junior researchers were huddled around their datapads, apparently conducting urgent reviews of their assumptions about human competence. Sparkles had dematerialized entirely, presumably to contemplate his existence across multiple dimensions, while trying to process the concept of being outsmarted by a being who couldn't even perceive 11 dimensions. Velteran lingered near the main console, occasionally glancing toward the corner where their resident human had returned to her reading. "What's she reading now?" he asked one of the junior researchers. "Still, the importance of being earnest, sir, has been for 3 days." "What's it about?" The junior researcher consulted his datapad. "According to the summary, it's about the importance of being earnest." Dr. Velteran considered this. "That seems straightforward." "Yes, sir, almost suspiciously so." In her corner, the human researcher smiled slightly at a particularly amusing passage about the nature of truth and identity. Around her, the station hummed with its usual sounds. The whisper of recycled air, the distant hum of quantum processors, the gentle burble of a coffee machine that had achieved consciousness and decided to be helpful rather than homicidal. It was, she reflected, a perfectly ordinary day on Prometheus Station, where the brightest minds in the galaxy gathered to prove that intelligence and wisdom were not, in fact, the same thing. The only difference was that now, when the emergency alarms went off, which they inevitably would again, those bright minds might just remember to ask the quiet human in the corner if she had any thoughts on the matter. After all, she'd only been sitting there for 6 months, reading her books and occasionally preventing universal catastrophe. Hardly worth mentioning, real. The coffee machine gurgled softly, in what might have been mechanical amusement, and somewhere in the depths of the station's computer systems, Aiden made a quiet note to update the personnel files. Under qualifications, it changed research support to research support. It seemed like a reasonable precaution,